From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! More than 300 protesters, overwhelmingly women, are arrested on Capitol Hill urging senators to vote against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. We'll speak to playwright and V-Day founder Eve Ensler, who just wrote an open letter in Time magazine to white women who support Brett Kavanaugh. Then the Nobel Peace Prize goes to Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist Nadia Murad and Congolese doctor Denis Mukwege for fighting sexual violence.
I realized that the operating room was not a solution. There I was just taking care of consequences of rape. And I started to ask myself, why this and how we can fight against the root causes of rape and show the world what is going on.
Eve Ensler will talk about their campaign against sexual violence, then to Rio, to Glenn Greenwald, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, on Sunday's election in Brazil. The current presidential frontrunner is a far-right former army officer who's openly praised Brazil's military dictatorship. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate will vote this morning on whether to end debate on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court, setting up a confirmation vote as early as Saturday. Key Republican senators, including Susan Collins of Maine, Jeff Flake of Arizona, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, have yet to announce their position on the vote. On Friday, both Senators Flake and Collins said the recent FBI background report into Kavanaugh was thorough and did not corroborate accusations against the nominee. Democratic leaders said the report, which was withheld from the public and was made available in a single copy to senators on Thursday, was incomplete. This is ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein.
The most notable part of this report is what's not in it. As we noted by the White House, the FBI did not interview Brett Kavanaugh, nor did the FBI interview Dr. Blasey Ford. What we've heard from numerous people over the last few days seeking to provide information to the FBI. We have seen even more press reports of witnesses who wanted to speak with the FBI but were not interviewed. Deborah Ramirez's lawyer said he was unaware of any corroborating witnesses who were interviewed.
Meanwhile, the National Council of Churches has called for Kavanaugh's nomination to be withdrawn, saying he showed extreme partisan bias during last week's Senate hearing into sexual assault allegations by Christine Blasey Ford against him. The group represents some 45 million churchgoers at 100,000 U.S. churches. In an unprecedented op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, Judge Kavanaugh argues he has the judicial temperament to join the high court, writing, "I was very emotional last Thursday, more so than I've ever been. I might have been too emotional at times. I know that my tone was sharp and I said a few things I shouldn't have said." On Thursday, retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens told an audience of retirees in Florida that though he originally supported Kavanaugh, he now opposes his confirmation.
I've changed my views for reasons that have no relationship to his intellectual ability or his record as a federal judge. He's a fine federal judge, and he should have been confirmed when he was nominated. But I think that his performance during the hearings caused me to change my mind.
The showdown over Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation came as thousands of protesters converged on Washington, D.C. Thursday, where nearly 300 people were arrested at a loud, peaceful sit-in in the atrium of the Hart Senate Office Building. Among those arrested was comedian and actress Amy Schumer. Also protesting was a group of women who confronted Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch as he sped into an elevator, challenged him over his support for Kavanaugh. Senator Hatch told the women to grow up waving them off as he boarded an elevator in the Hart building.
Why aren't you brave enough to talk to us and exchange it with us? Don't you wave your hand at me. I wave my hand at you. When you grow up, when I grow up, how dare you talk to women that way? How dare you that first? How dare you?
Thursday, thousands marched from Capitol Hill to a protest outside the Supreme Court. After headlines, we'll have more on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination with award-winning playwright and author Eve Ensler. In Yemen, tens of thousands of people rallied in the streets of Taiz, Yemen's second-largest city, Thursday, protesting the collapse of Yemen's economy and the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign. Three-quarters of Yemenis, some 22 million people, are dependent on international aid, with an estimated 8.4 million people on the brink of starvation. This is protester Shahab Mohammed.
We are starving and our children are dying. The cities are under siege and there's unemployment. We want to tell the regime and the Saudi-led coalition that when hunger is the engine for these people, discussions, negotiations, and treaties collapse, and the only solution is immediately supplying a loaf of bread.
Thursday's protest came as the head of a team of UN investigators accused Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates of interfering with his investigation. Kamel Jandoubi says all sides in Yemen's conflict have committed human rights abuses, with the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition responsible for war crimes, including widespread arbitrary detention, rape, torture, and the conscription of children as young as 8 years old. In August, Republican Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama blocked an amendment by Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy that would have cut off U.S. taxpayer support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Bloomberg is reporting China inserted microchips into servers used by major tech companies such as Apple and Amazon that give backdoor access to data. The minuscule grain of rice-sized chip would allow hackers to bypass security and remotely access the networks of these companies. Both Apple and Amazon are denying the claims in the report. Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence accused China of interfering in the U.S. midterm elections in order to undermine President Trump and his agenda.
The American people deserve to know. In response to the strong stand that President Trump has taken, Beijing is pursuing a comprehensive and coordinated campaign to undermine support for the president, our agenda, and our nation's most cherished ideals.
Pence's warning to Beijing comes amidst a growing U.S.-China trade war and as the Pentagon's reportedly planning a massive show of force in November, with warships and planes set to carry out exercises near China's territorial waters in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. Meanwhile, the Justice Department has indicted 7 Russian agents for conspiring to hack the computers of anti-doping officials who uncovered a massive ring of state-sponsored cheating by athletes ahead of the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. U.S. Attorney Scott Brady said Thursday the 7 agents have ties to GRU, Russia's military intelligence body. He said they went on to attempt hacks against other targets.
They targeted Westinghouse, a nuclear power company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that supplied nuclear fuel to the Ukraine. They targeted the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was investigating the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the poisoning of a former GRU officer and his daughter in the UK. And they targeted a lab in Switzerland that analyzed the nerve agent used in that poisoning.
The Dutch Defense Ministry says counterintelligence officials broke up a hacking attempt by the Russians as they attempted to break into a Marriott hotel Wi-Fi from a parking lot in The Hague. The Dutch said the Russians had a receipt which showed they took a taxi ride from the headquarters of the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service, to Moscow's main airport. Russia's rejected the indictments, calling them part of a disinformation campaign. The Trump administration's warning India it could face sanctions over its decision to purchase a $5 billion missile defense system from Russia. Talk of U.S. sanctions came as Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin to New Delhi Thursday. U.S. weapons makers Lockheed Martin and Boeing are seeking contracts worth billions of dollars to replace India's aging fleet of Russian-built warplanes. Brazilian voters head to the polls Sunday in a hotly contested presidential election that could have major repercussions throughout the country and the region. The front-runner is far-right leader Jair Bolsonaro, who's praised Brazil's military dictatorship and made numerous racist, homophobic and sexist remarks. His primary opponent, former president and head of the Workers' Party, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had to drop out of the race from prison, where he's been since April, on what many consider to be trumped-up corruption charges. His hand-picked successor, Fernando Haddad, is currently placing second in most polls. We'll have more on Brazil with journalist Glenn Greenwald later in the broadcast. In Oslo, Norway, officials of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee have named this year's recipients.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2018 to Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad for their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict.
Dr. Denis Mukwege founded the Panzi Hospital in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1999. The clinic receives thousands of women each year, many of them requiring surgery as a result of sexual violence. Nadia Murad is a 25-year-old Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq. She was kidnapped by the Islamic State, repeatedly raped, as she was held as a sex slave for almost 3 years. After headlines, we'll speak with Eve Ensler, who's worked extensively with Dr. Mukwege in the Congo. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Leon Lederman died Wednesday in an Idaho nursing home at the age of 96. In 1988, Lederman won the Nobel Physics Prize for his pioneering work on subatomic particles. In recent years, he began suffering from dementia. In 2015, Dr. Lederman sold his Nobel Prize medal for $765,000 in order to pay for his mounting medical and nursing home costs. And the 2018 MacArthur Fellows were announced Thursday, recognizing leadership and dedication in a range of fields, including the arts, sciences, and human rights. This year's recipients include pastor and activist Reverend William Barber, who helped spearhead the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, which protests issues related to voting rights, poverty, discrimination, and environmental rights. Reverend Barber was being arrested as the fellowship was announced, as he joined a Chicago protest demanding McDonald's increase their minimum wage. Other fellows include journalist Ken Ward, who documents the impact of coal and natural gas industries in West Virginia, and Becca Heller, human rights lawyer working on behalf of refugees. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. More than 300 protesters, mostly women, were arrested on Thursday during a massive sit-in in Capitol Hill against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, who's been accused of sexual assault and misconduct by multiple women. The Senate's planning to hold a key procedural vote on his confirmation this morning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. This comes just one day after senators were given their first chance to see the FBI's new investigation into Kavanaugh. Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon blasted the FBI probe as a horrific cover-up Thursday. A final vote on Kavanaugh's confirmation is expected on Saturday. The decision rests on 4 senators who have not yet announced how they will vote. Republican Senators Susan Collins of Maine, Jeff Flake of Arizona, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, as well as Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia. On Thursday, Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota announced she will vote against Kavanaugh. Opposition to Kavanaugh is growing across the country. Former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, a lifelong Republican, said Kavanaugh does not belong on the high court following his partisan remarks during last week's hearing. The editorial boards of The Washington Post and The New York Times also came out against Kavanaugh. This marks the first time The Washington Post has opposed a Supreme Court nominee in over 30 years. The last was Robert Bork in 1987. Meanwhile, Judge Kavanaugh himself has published an unprecedented op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal defending himself. In the column, he vowed to be an independent, impartial judge, but admitted he said a few things last week he should not have said. We're joined now by Eve Ensler, award-winning playwright and author of the Vagina Monologues. She's also the founder of V-Day, a movement to end violence against women and girls. She just published a letter to white women who support Brett Kavanaugh in Time magazine. Before we go, just after we talk about this, we're going to talk about today's announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize. But, Eve, you have dedicated your life to fighting sexual violence. Thousands of women, mainly women, went to protest on Capitol Hill, not just yesterday. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of arrests over the last few weeks since the beginning hearings at the beginning of September of Judge Kavanaugh. Your thoughts?
Well, I think we're in the middle of a gender war. I think Trump has essentially declared a war. And I think the fact that all of this, I was just listening to the speed at which this is all being done, the language that they're talking about, plowing it through, ramming it through, getting it through. It all feels like this culture of rape, that we're doing things so quickly that no one has time to think or breathe or see or feel. And I think what's happened, and I'm hearing from many, many activists and survivors throughout the country, women are outraged. Women are in trauma. Women feel like what has happened to them, their experiences, their bodies, their histories, their stories are not being taken seriously, that this is a decimating experience, but it's also an experience that is bringing women to rage and to react. And I feel like if the Senate moves forward with Brett Kavanaugh and is not listening in the same way that Orrin Hatch yesterday dismissed that group of women and told them to grow up, to a group of survivors who were asking him to look at them.
Let's go to that clip. This was Thursday, and once again, as happened with Jeff Flake, women saw a senator going to an elevator. This one was Utah Senator Orrin Hatch, and they came up to him at the elevator.
Why aren't you brave enough to talk to us and exchange it with us? Don't you wave your hand at me. I wave my hand at you.
When you grow up, Robinson.
When I grow up, we grow up. How dare you talk to women that way? How dare you? How dare you?
He says, grow up, and then waves at them as the elevator door closes, as they say, how dare you?
The level of patronization, the level of absolute dismissal and indifference. I mean, we are seeing, and the way that the Republicans, in the true crying rapist trope, have reversed this and made themselves the victim is really quite astonishing.
Fascinatingly, North Dakota Democrat Heidi Heitkamp, she and Joe Manchin were considered the Democrats that might vote for Judge Kavanaugh. She was interviewed on local television in North Dakota, and this is what she said.
The most important thing you can tell a victim, if you in fact do, is that you believe them. The process has been bad. But at the end of the day, you have to make a decision, and I've made that decision.
And that decision will be what, Senator?
I will be voting no on Judge Kavanaugh.
And she actually came close to tears as she said this may not be politically expedient. She's in a very tough race with a Republican. But she said she could not, given her own background, vote for Judge Kavanaugh.
Well, thank God a woman listened to her deepest voice. I mean, we know that 1 out of 3 women in the world will be beaten or raped. We know that thousands, millions of survivors across this country are feeling that they are not being believed, that they are not being listened to, that their concerns are not being taken seriously. This, after years and years and years of work, it feels like something that is just totally unacceptable.
You have written so many books, the most recent in The Body of the World. You wrote a letter in Time magazine. Can you share it with us today?
I'd be happy to.
And talk about why you particularly address white women here.
Well, one of the main reasons I'm addressing white women is the statistics. The statistics say that most white men support Kavanaugh. 45% of white women support him. 30% of Hispanic women and 11% of African-American women.
I mean, the number in African-Americans, something like more than 80% of African-Americans are opposed to Judge Kavanaugh.
Yes, that's right. And only 11% are supporting him. So I, again, was astonished by this, and I just went into my soul, and I felt like I wanted to reach out to those women to talk to them. So I wrote them this letter. Dear white women who support Brett Kavanaugh, last night when I saw Donald Trump mock Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, I couldn't help focusing on the women behind him who cheered and laughed. I felt like I was falling into a familiar nightmare. It compelled me to reach out to you. When I was a child, my father sexually abused and beat me. My mother did not protect me. She sided with my father, just like these women sided with Donald Trump. And I understand why. She sided with him because he was the breadwinner. She sided with him because of her need to survive. She sided with him because the reality of what was happening in front of her was so terrible, it was easier not to see. She sided with him because she was brought up never to question a man. She was taught to serve men and make them happy. She was trained not to believe women. It was only much later, after my father died, that she was able to acknowledge the truth of my childhood and to ask for my forgiveness. It was only then too late that she was able to see how she had sacrificed her daughter for security and comfort. She used those words, "I was her sacrifice." Some people, when they look at this video of women laughing at Dr. Ford, will see callousness. I see distancing. I see denial. I've worked on ending violence against women for 20 years. I have traveled this country many times. I have sat with women of all ages and political persuasions. I remember the first performance of my play, The Vagina Monologues, in Oklahoma City, when the women, half the women in the audience, came up after to tell me they had been raped or abused. Most of them whispered it to me, and often I was the first and only person they had told. Until that moment, they had found a way to normalize it, expect it, accept it, deny it. I don't believe you want to choose your sons and your husbands over your daughters. I don't believe you want the pain that was inflicted on us, inflicted on future generations. I know the risk many of you take coming out to say you believe a woman over a man. It means you might then have to recognize and believe your own experience. If 1 out of 3 women in the world have been raped or beaten, it must mean some of you have had this experience. To believe in other women means having to touch into the pain and fear and sorrow and rage of your own experience. And that feels unbearable sometimes. I know because it took me years to come out of my own denial and to break with my perpetrator, my father. To speak the truth that risks upending the comfort of my very carefully constructed life. But I can tell you that living a lie is living half a life. It was only after telling my story that I knew happiness and freedom. I know the risk others of you face who have witnessed those you love suffer the traumatic after effects of violence, and those who worry for both your sons and daughters that they may someday face this violence. I write to you because we need you, the way I once needed my mother. We need you to stand with women who are breaking the silence in spite of their terror and shame. I believe inside the bodies of some of those women who laughed at the rally were other impulses and feelings they weren't expressing. Here's why I believe you should take this stand with me. Violence against women destroys our souls. It annihilates our sense of self. It numbs us. It separates us from our bodies. It is the tool used to keep us second-class citizens. And if we don't address it, it can lead to depression, alcoholism, drug addiction, overeating, and suicide. It makes us believe we are not worthy of a life of happiness. It took my mother 40 years to see what her denial had done and to apologize to me. I don't think you want to apologize to your daughters 40 years from now. Stop the ascension of a man who is angry, aggressive, vengeful, and could very well be a sexual assaulter. Time is short. Call your senators. Stop laughing and start fighting. With all my love. Eve.
Eve Ensler, award-winning playwright and author of The Vagina Monologues and so much more, founder of V-Day. Eve, before we go to break and then talk to you about this remarkable day of the Nobel Peace Prize and what it means for everyone, I wanted to ask you about the significance. Just as you said, you started to perform the Vagina Monologues, and so many women came out saying they'd been abused or raped. This week and these last weeks, so many women have spoken out about their sexual assaults against them for the first time. It's as if the whole country is suffering from PTSD.
And I want to say to all those survivors, your pain matters. Your experience matters. What you've been through matters. The trauma that you have faced matters. And that there are many of us supporting you, loving you, holding you as you try to heal from this experience. That mass of conglomerate, patriarchal, misogynist white men do not reflect so many people in this country.
The Senate Judiciary Committee The Republicans on it are all white men, and there has never been one Republican woman on the Senate Judiciary Committee in all of U.S. history.
And I think the fact that 55% of the GOP has said that a person being a sexual assaulter shouldn't prevent them from being on the Supreme Court is an indication of how entrenched, how deeply entrenched sexual violence and misogyny is in the Republican Party.
When we come back, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to two people, one man and one woman, who Eve Ensler has worked with, fighting sexual violence. Stay with us.
I raise my arms to the sky. On my knees I pray. I'm not afraid anymore. I will walk through that door. Dance, rise, walk. Dance, rise. I can see a world where we all live, safe and free from all oppression. No more rape or incest or abuse. Women are not a possession. You never owned me, don't even know me. I'm not invisible, I'm simply wonderful. I feel my heart for the first time racing. I feel alive, I feel so amazing.
Break the Chain, music by Tina Clark and Tim Hines, and produced by Eve Ensler and V-Day. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn now to the Nobel Peace Prize. Officials announced this year's recipients early this morning in Oslo, Norway.
Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2018 to Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad for their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict.
Dr. Denis Mukwege founded the Panzi Hospital in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1999. The clinic receives thousands of women each year, many of them requiring surgery as a result of sexual violence. Nadia Murad is a 25-year-old Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq. She was kidnapped and held by the Islamic State for almost 3 years. During her captivity, she was repeatedly raped, held as a sex slave, she said. In 2009, Denis Mukwege appeared on Democracy Now! Along with our guest today, Eve Ensler. I asked him to talk about how he got involved in fighting against sexual violence.
C'est une situation qui est particulièrement difficile.
It's a particularly difficult situation.
Depuis 10 ans,
For the past 10 years,
on s'est retrouvé qu'à l'hôpital, on
at
reçoit
the
des
hospital,
femmes
we have women
qui sont non seulement violées,
that are not only
mais
raped,
elles ont été torturées.
but have been tortured
Leur
also.
appareil génital a
Their
été
genitals
littéralement
has been literally
détruit.
destroyed.
Et ce sont souvent de jeunes personnes
And they're all often young.
qui sont au début de leur vie pratique.
They're at the beginning of their
Et
youth.
dans la condition elle nous arrive, elle arrive dans une condition
And
où
they
elle
arrive in
perd
such a
les
conditions
matières fécales, les urines,
where
et c'est
urines
très
and
dur
fecals
de les prendre en charge.
are coming out, and it's very hard to take
Mais
them
je pense que si nous sommes là,
and take care
c'est
to
puisque
those
aussi
women. But
nous avons
we are
l'espoir,
here because we have hope,
puisque le monde peut écouter.
and
Le
we have
monde
hope
peut
that
se
the world
rendre
can
compte
listen.
qu'il est inadmissible
It is
à notre
unacceptable. It is
siècle que les
unbearable
femmes soient traitées de cette
that
façon.
women are treated this way.
Who is committing these crimes?
Qui commet ces crimes?
Ce sont des crimes qui sont commis par
These
des
crimes are
groupes
committed
armés.
by
Vous savez,
armed groups.
depuis les 10 dernières années,
For the
le
past 10
Congo a été
years, the
occupé
Congo
par
has been
7
occupied
armées
by 7 armies.
et chaque armée,
And each army,
chaque groupe armé,
each armed group,
y compris même
including
les forces armées congolaises,
including the Congolese armed forces,
chaque groupe commet ses propres
each group
sur les
commits its
femmes.
own atrocities.
Et je pense que
C'est grave puisque
And I
finalement
think
les
it's
femmes n'ont
a
pas
very
de
big deal
recours.
because women
Même
have no
celles-là qui
hope.
sont supposées le protéger,
Even those who are supposed to protect her
elles sont en train de les abuser et les torturer.
abuse
et les
and
détruire.
torture her.
Talk more about the City of Joy, Dr. Mukwende.
Lorsque nous prenons en charge les femmes à l'hôpital,
When we take care of women at the
ce sont
hospital,
des femmes qui sont non seulement
these
qui ont des
women
plaies physiques, mais elles
are
ont
wounded
aussi de traumatismes
physically but are
profonds,
also traumatized
psychologiques.
profoundly.
Et vous savez, on ne peut pas comme ça
And it's not
comme
possible
une plaie
just like that
soigner
to cure
le
them.
trauma. Ça prend du temps.
It takes time.
Et parfois, très
Sometimes
longtemps.
a lot of time.
Comme on ne peut pas les chasser de l'hôpital,
We
les
cannot
renvoyer
kick
dans
them
les-
out of the hospital.
on avait besoin d'un endroit
So we needed a place
où les femmes peuvent rester
where women can stay
pour être prises en charge
to
sur
be
le
taken
plan
care of.
psychologique et pour en fait les entraîner
And to
à une
train them
réinsertion sociale sur le plan
to
économique,
reinsert socially
mais aussi leur donner la capacité
and to give
de
them
reprendre
the
leur dignité,
possibility and the
pour être
ability
capables
to take
de
care
se
of
battre
themselves
dans la vie, puisque
and to be
ils
able
ont la
to
capacité.
fight in life because they do
Et
have
j'ai vu
the capabilities of doing this.
transformations
I have seen amazing transformations.
Un potentiel dans les femmes que je ne peux
There is
pas
an
imaginer.
enormous potential in
Les
women
femmes
that
qui
I
arrivent
did not imagine.
complètement détruites.
They arrive completely destroyed
Et luttent contre la
and they
vie
fight.
et la mort.
And they fight
Mais
between life and
après,
death.
vous les retrouvez avec une force.
But afterwards, they have an incredible
La
strength.
cité de la joie va leur
The
donner
City
cette
of Joy
possibilité
will give them this
d'être à un endroit où
possibility
on peut les aider à dire on vous a
to
blessé,
say
on
what
a
happened
essayé
to
de
them,
vous détruire,
to tell that
restez
they
forts, vous êtes
people have
forts,
tried to
vous êtes dignes,
destroy them,
et
but
vous pouvez vous battre.
we can tell them that they're strong and can fight.
That's Dr. Denis Mukwege almost a decade ago on Democracy Now! Today, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Nadia Murad, the 25-year-old Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist, also won. This is Nadia Murad speaking at the UN in 2016.
Before ISIS came to my village, there was nothing more important to me than my dignity, than my mother, my dear mother. And although she is now gone, my dear mother is with me here today in soul and in spirit. She, along with my brothers and so many others, left this world too soon. And my life in Sinjal as a simple Yazidi farm girl is gone forever. The dreams and hopes of my whole community are gone. As you have heard, the night of August 3rd, 2014, everything changed. Daesh came to kidnap, to murder, to rape. This was genocide. It is that simple. In a matter of days, if not hours, thousands of Yazidis were killed and thousands of women and children were taken. Just because they were Yazidis. I was taken to Mosul with others. I was used in the way they wanted to use me. I was not alone. And perhaps I was the lucky one. As time passed, I found a way to escape where thousand others could not. They are still captive.
Nobel Peace Prize winner Nadia Murad through a translator at the UN, and Dr. Denis Mukwege. We're continuing with Eve Ensler, the award-winning playwright and author, founder of V-Day. You just got off the phone with Dr. Mukwege, speaking to him at the hospital in the Congo. Talk about, and you've worked with both of them, Nadia as well. Mm-hmm. Talk about Dr. Mukwege's work and the work you both have done together in Congo.
Well, I just want to say, Carl Jung once said that surviving this century will be holding two opposite thoughts at the same time, And I'm thinking here we have the Kavanaugh hearings and Dr. Mukwege. So what I want to say is Dr. Mukwege and Nadia, I mean, it's so fantastic that they've chosen both a doctor who has been fighting to end rape as a weapon of war and a survivor of that, and that they've honored them together because it's such a model of how men and women should be working together on these issues across the world. I met Dr. Mukwege in 2006 when I was asked to interview him for the UN. And when I met him, I was overwhelmed by the fact that his eyes were so bloodshot, witnessing all the atrocities and horrors he had seen. He invited me to come to the Democratic Republic of Congo so Vide could support his work. And I remember the first day I arrived at Pansy Hospital, and there were hundreds and hundreds of women, all of whom had been tortured and raped, many of whom had been operated on. All of them were in the hospital under his care, under his love, under his magnificent, radiant energy. And I stood there and I thought I had arrived at the end of the world. But there was this man, this towering man of grace and dignity and commitment and devotion, literally sewing up women's vaginas as fast as the militias were tearing them apart, and desperately trying to get the word out to the world that this war, this economic war that was being fought for the resources, particularly coltan, which goes into our cell phones and computers, where militias are desecrating villages, having husbands rape daughters and sons rape mothers, so they destroy the families flee, the militias take over the mines, and they are proxies for multinationals who then take the coltan back to us to go into our cell phones and computers. I saw this man who, I had never seen a man like that. I had never seen a man who was literally giving his life to stop rape, to end sexual violence, to call attention to what rape as a systematic tool of war was doing to the women of Congo and would be doing if it were not curtailed to many more women throughout the world in many more countries. And I have watched him. I mean, I have had the privilege of traveling with him across this country, across Europe, across the world, Africa, where I have watched him tell his story over and over at the UN, at the European parliaments, at the White House, telling it and telling it and telling it, risking ostracization, risking criticism, risking his life. There was an assassination attempt on him, I think, 4 years ago, where they almost murdered him and murdered the driver who worked with him, kidnapped his daughter for 20 minutes, and now he is living literally under security at the hospital, no longer living in his home. He is a man of devotion, and I think at this moment, he is modeling a way of being as a man who is standing with survivors, with us. And he said to me this morning, he said, this award is not just my award. It's an award for every survivor in this world, every woman who has been working for years to end this. And he said, we don't just need recognition, we need reparations. We need to end impunity, because impunity is allowing this to continue and continue. And as we're seeing at the Supreme Court, if there is no justice, if there is no accountability, this is how rape spreads. And we have seen that over 14 years in the Congo.
You know, I could only think, there was all sorts of discussions of the short list, and Dr. Mukwege has been on that list for a number of years. He was even, the Nobel Prize officials were even asked about why this year. And you have to think about that, because among the other people whose names were being bandied about for this war today was President Trump, because of the North Korea issue and resolving that war. And you could only imagine perhaps someone said, but look at, 16 women have accused him of sexual assault, and the Nobel Committee is dealing with its own controversies around sexual assault and rape. And so they went in the other direction. And they honored Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, who Vide has also supported.
Nadia is one of the most extraordinary, brave, grace-filled woman, and we had the pleasure of working with her and supporting Yazidi women, and I got to meet her and I did a piece about her. But she's so young. She has been through some of the worst atrocities, but she has turned her life to devoting it to not only saving the women and speaking out against the genocide against the Yazidi people, but also becoming an incredible spokesperson and model for ending the scourge of sexual violence and used as a weapon of war in armed conflict. And I think this award hopefully will signal to the world, and particularly to men, that there is a different way of being, that we have to honor survivors, we have to honor women like Nadia Murad who stand up, and we have to say to men, there isn't a way you can act. You can devote your life to ending violence against women. You can devote your life to working with and standing beside us, and you don't become less of a man. You become more of a man and more of a human. I mean, you only have to meet Dr. Mukwege to see the light, to see the radiance, to see the love, to see the beauty that pours through that man who has given his life to the women of his country.
You know, today, Eve, also marks the first anniversary of the explosive expose in the New York Times around Harvey Weinstein, really the beginning of the Me Too movement as it's being talked about today, though it was formulated well before that. How far have we come? As you point out, the irony of this day, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to those who fight sexual violence and to sexual violence survivors, and today the vote of the Senate, the first vote, the second supposedly as early as tomorrow, not clear, on whether Brett Kavanaugh, who's been accused of sexual assault by several women, will be confirmed to the Supreme Court.
It's a good question, because it seems like the white men in power, that Republican Judiciary Committee and the Republicans are not getting it, are not waking up, are not feeling it, are not in tune. But the genie's out of the bottle. Women are out of the bottle now. They are never going back in. And I think whatever happens with the Kavanaugh hearing, it will never sit right with women of this country. It will never sit right with them.
Well, there are elections within a month.
Exactly. Not only elections, but I believe a fury is being unleashed in women, a fury and a determination that we will never turn back from at this point. And I just want to say to all survivors and women out there, this is our crucible moment. And we need to, after whatever happens here, we need to rise and make sure the window that has been opened never closes again. It can't.
Eve Ensler, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Award-winning playwright, author of The Vagina Monologues and so many other books, her latest, In the Body of the World, founder of V-Day. This is Democracy Now! We'll link to her letter to white women against Brett Kavanaugh, or her opposition, expressing her opposition to Brett Kavanaugh, but her letter to white women who are supporting Brett Kavanaugh at democracynow.org. When we come back, we head south to Brazil, where major elections are taking place this weekend. We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Stay with us.
Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Café tá na mulher, café tá na cobra coral. Oh, num pedaço de pão. Na maré, na lâmina de punhal, oh, na luz, na escuridão. Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Oh lá lá, andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Oh menina, andar com fé eu vou, café não costuma falhar. Afeta na manhã, afeta no anoitecer, oh, no calor do verão.
Andar com fé, Walk with Faith, by the Brazilian musician Gilberto Gil. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Voters in Brazil head to the polls Sunday, an election that could reshape the political landscape of South America. Polls show the current frontrunner is the far-right Jair Bolsonaro, a former army officer who's openly praised Brazil's military dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 1985. Bolsonaro has a long history of making racist, misogynistic, homophobic comments. He's encouraged police to kill suspected drug dealers. Most polls show Bolsonaro winning on Sunday, but failing to win enough votes to avoid a runoff election October 28th. He's risen to the polls since September 8th, when he was stabbed while campaigning. Bolsonaro also directly benefited from the jailing of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in April, who had been leading all presidential polls. Lula remains in jail on what many consider trumped-up corruption charges to prevent him from becoming president. Lula, the head of the Workers' Party, was then forced to drop out of the race. Lula's handpicked successor, Fernando Haddad, is currently placing second in most polls. On Saturday, tens of thousands took part in women-led rallies in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and other cities to protest Bolsonaro. The theme of the protests, not him.
My name is Jade, and I'm here because Bolsonaro is dangerous. He represents hatred for our country, because he represents the loss of the few rights that the people he targets, such as the black people, the indigenous people, and the LGBT community and women have conquered so far. He represents a threat to democracy in our country, a democracy that we are still building.
Joining us in Rio de Janeiro's Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who co-founded The Intercept. Glenn, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the significance of what is happening right now in Brazil, and particularly on Sunday, the election?
To begin with, the significance is that Brazil is a country of 210 million people, so it's the fifth most populous country in the world, right behind the United States, the second largest in the hemisphere and the most influential in all of Latin America. It's also the seventh largest economy in the world with major oil reserves. And what the Western media has often been doing in talking about Bolsonaro is calling him Brazil's Trump, which drastically and radically understates the case. He's much closer to, say, Duterte in the Philippines or even General Sisi in Egypt, both in terms of what he intends to do and wants to do, and what he's able to do, given the fragility of Brazil, which is an extremely young democracy that exited a military dictatorship only 33 years ago, and therefore doesn't have the same kind of institutions to limit what someone would want to do the way, say, the United States or the UK would. So it's an extremely dangerous moment for this country. Polls do show that he's unlikely to win in the first round on Sunday, but there is a possibility that he might, that he could actually just get 50% of the vote and avoid a runoff entirely. But even if he does make the runoff, the signs are really showing that he is likely to win against Lula's handpicked successor because of how much animus has been built up by the media and the business class toward PT in this country.
And can you talk more about just exactly what Bolsonaro represents, his homophobic comments, his anti-women comments, his support of the Brazilian military dictatorship?
And, you can go through the whole list of shocking comments. He once said in an interview that he would rather hear that his son died in a car accident than hear that his son is gay. He told a colleague in the lower house of Congress, where he served for 30 years, when she accused him of defending torture and rape, which he did during the dictatorship, that she need not worry because, in his words, she didn't deserve to be raped by him, meaning that she was too ugly to deserve and merit his rape. There's a whole slew of comments like that about black people, about the indigenous. But the much more worrying aspect are not these kind of comments, but the policies that he is explicitly endorsing. His model for how he wants to deal with crime are the world's worst dictators, people like Pinochet. He's advocated that we do things like in the Philippines, where we just send the military and the police to just indiscriminately slaughter whoever they think is a drug dealer or a criminal without trials. He believes in military rule. He doesn't regard the military coup of 1964 and the 21-year resulting military dictatorship as a coup or as a dictatorship. He regards it as something noble and wants to replicate it. And he has the entire top level of the Brazilian military supporting him and behind him. So you really don't have institutions the way you do in the U.S., like a strong Supreme Court or a kind of deep state of the CIA and the FBI, or political parties that would constrain him in what he wants to do. And especially given how much popular support there now is behind him, there's a substantial part of the country that is genuinely terrified about what he intends to do, and intends to do rather quickly and probably can do, namely bringing back the worst abuses of the kinds of dictatorships that summarily executed dissidents, that shut down media outlets, that closed congresses that we thought was a thing of the past here in Latin America, but is now on the verge of returning to its most important and largest country.
Last month, the world-renowned dissident linguist Noam Chomsky met with Brazil's imprisoned former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, his visit coming shortly after Lula officially pulled out of the presidential race. Speaking outside the prison after a visit, Noam Chomsky condemned the right-wing media in Brazil.
have just had the great privilege of spending an hour with Lula, and one of the points that he emphasized was that during his entire tenure in office, there was just a constant flood of attacks from all the media, constant, thousands of attacks from every direction, which of course confuses and undermines public opinion. So the answer to your question is something is needed to counter the concentrated power of right-wing media, which particularly in Latin America just overwhelms everything.
So that is Noam Chomsky. Glenn Greenwald, a couple questions about that. How is the media allowed to cover Noam Chomsky visiting Lula in prison? And also the significance of what's happened to Lula and then who Haddad, the person, the hand-picked successor to Lula, is.
So I met with Noam Chomsky after that meeting in Sao Paulo, and we talked a lot about the dynamics that have brought us to this point. And one of the things we focused most on during our discussion was the fact that the dynamic is so similar to what's happening in the U.S., the U.K., and in Western Europe, where you see this spread of extremism and this rise of right-wing fanaticism, and the media outlets and the establishment factions that have laid the groundwork for its rise refuse to take any responsibility. And that's definitely the case here in Brazil, where a very oligarchical media is in the hands of a small number of very rich families and has sown the seeds and has kind of created the climate in which Bolsonaro's victory is possible. Even to this very minute, even though these journalists are themselves afraid of a Bolsonaro win and are not supporting him, they nonetheless continue to endorse this narrative that is the biggest asset for Bolsonaro, which is the idea that PT, the Workers' Party, and Bolsonaro are just opposite sides of the same coin. You have left-wing dictatorship or right-wing dictatorship, and both are equally bad. PT ran this country for 14 years, and whatever else you might want to say about it, whatever mistakes they made, you certainly had a very free and open press that constantly attacked it. They impeached one of their presidents and put the other one in prison. So the idea that it's a dictatorship on par with what Bolsonaro wants to do is grotesque, but it's the sort of thing that's normalizing Bolsonaro. And the thing that he has done, Bolsonaro, that's probably the smartest, is he has chosen as his kind of economic guru, the person he said he was going to put in charge of the economy, a kind of classic right-wing University of Chicago neoliberal economist that the international market and that the oligarchical class absolutely adores. And so it's kind of neutralized what otherwise would have been the opposition to them. And what they've done to Lula, not just putting him in prison when he was leading the polls, but since then, what they've done is they've banned all media outlets from even being able to interview Lula. We've tried, others have tried. There's a prior restraint order on the part of the Supreme Court to prevent Lula from being able to speak out at this crucial moment. It's not enough just to put him in prison and to stop him from running when people wanted him to be president. They've silenced him through censorship orders that apply not just to him, but to all of us in the media. And so Brazilian institutions, the Brazilian establishment bears a lot of blame, just like U.S. institutions do for the rise of Trump, British institutions do for Brexit, and just the general globalization policies of Europe does for the rise of right-wing extremism in that part of the world as well.
I want to turn to former Brazilian president, or the former Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva himself, front-runner until he was jailed. I spoke to him right before he went to jail, and he was talking about the presidential candidate, Jair Bolsonaro.
Não, ele é deputado federal,
He is a member of the federal Congress. He was an army captain in the Brazilian army. The information that we have is that he was expelled from the Brazilian army. And his behavior is far right-wing, fascist. He is very much prejudiced against women, against blacks, against indigenous persons, against human rights. He believes that everything can be resolved with violence. So I don't think he has a future in Brazilian politics. He has the right to run. he speaks. He projects a certain image that to please a part of the society that is of the extreme right. But I don't believe that the Brazilian people have an interest in electing someone with his sort of behavior to serve as president of the Republic.
Do you think he was happy with Marielle's death?
I think so, because he's preaching violence every day. He preaches violence. He believes that those who defend human rights are doing a disservice to democracy. He thinks that those who defend women's rights are doing a disservice to democracy. Likewise, those who defend the rights of the black community. He is against everything that is discussed when one is talking about human rights.
That was Luis Inácio Lula da Silva speaking in March on Democracy Now! For the hour. You can check it out, democracynow.org. And at the end, he was talking about the assassination of Rio City Councilwoman Marielle Franco. Your comments on what he said as we begin to wrap up, Glenn.
So, I mean, just the last part about the assassination of Marielle Franco, which I've spoken on your show about before, just to give you a sense of what the climate is like here. Just this week, 2 candidates from Bolsonaro's party, including one of whom who's running for Congress and ran as the vice mayoral candidate of Bolsonaro's son, who ran for mayor of Rio 4 years ago, took a street sign in commemoration of Marielle Franco and broke it in half. And wearing shirts that had pistols on them pointed directly at the camera, displayed it proudly for the camera. And then the last line of the post on social media that they wrote to accompany the photo was, for you scumbag leftists, when we take over, your days are numbered. Exactly as Lula said, the climate is one of violence. Bolsonaro's signature gestures for his campaign is to put his fingers in the position of a pistol. They want to use violence to solve political problems here. They're very explicit and open about that. But unfortunately, everybody who's been in charge of Brazilian society, including PT, including the establishment, needs to also ask itself what it has done to make this country lose so much hope and faith that it's willing to abandon democracy and turn to a demagogue and an extremist like Bolsonaro. That's the key question that I think needs to be asked if he does end up winning.
Glenn, we're going to do part 2 of this discussion and post it online at democracynow.org on a number of issues. But in this last minute, you are a constitutional lawyer. Your thoughts as you look north to the United States, you are an American citizen, on the nomination and possible confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court in just 30 seconds, if you can.
So I do think there are real due process questions when it comes to accusations about somebody that we ought to take very seriously. At the same time, there's a lot of credible evidence, and I think even more important, the behavior that he displayed and the very partisan messages that he's been delivering his whole life and at that hearing make it impossible to imagine him on the Supreme Court in a way that could be have that institution be a credible apolitical body, and I think that's the real overarching issue.
Well, I want to thank you, Glenn, for being with us. Again, we will do part 2 and talk about a number of issues, including President Trump and Vice President Pence's attacks on China, saying they are the real threats to the midterm elections, the indictment of Russian hackers, as well as more on Judge Kavanaugh and what's happening in the world today. Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. Also, you can go to democracynow.org for our hour with Lula, who is now in prison in Brazil. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, Sharina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.